Hello, this is Tim Weber from South Texas College, coming to you again to continue the topic of motivation and emotions. And so this time we're going to pick up more of the traditional understanding of those things among psychologists. The previous video having to do with sort of my interpretation of the information that's out there. So if you didn't catch that one about the introduction to this topic, do make sure you catch that. At any rate, once again, want to encourage you to take some notes, Juan. And so here we go. Let me go ahead and bring up, first of all, our outline that we'll be using. Here it is. Okay, so you will find also this is consistent with what you find in your textbook. So traditional perspectives on motivation. Traditionally, we have four perspectives used to explain motivation, which include instinct theory, drive reduction theory, arousal theory, and hierarchy of motives. So we'll look at each one of those one at a time and see what they have to offer. So starting with instinct theory. First of all, a little definition. Instincts, strictly speaking, are complex behaviors that are rigidly performed throughout a species. They are behaviors that are built in, triggered by certain stimuli. They are not learned behaviors. And so strictly speaking, first of all, complex behavior. So not a reflex, not that simple, but behaviors that require numerous steps to complete and so forth, rigidly performed throughout a species. So you will see every individual in that species engaging in that behavior under the right circumstances. And the behavior rigidly performed. In other words, there is a certain way that it's done, and we may try to alter it and maybe influence it somewhat for a short time, but even then, it's going to drift back to its instinctive form of behavior. Um, Also, these instincts then are built in, they are inherited, and built into the nervous system physiology of the animal. So these do not have to be learned. So an example, here you have this particular species of bird, and these birds will engage in the complex behavior of gathering certain materials to make a nest under certain circumstances. And those specific materials then are woven into this very shape. So every bird of this species will do this under the right circumstances. If you see one of these around, you know one of these types of birds is somewhere nearby. The bird does not have to see another bird doing it. It is not trial and error. It is simply built in to their nervous system to do this. So that's an instinct. Now, when we look at humans, what do we have that would fit this description? If you think a little bit, you're going to say, well, gosh, that's hard to come up with. And some people might suggest, well, what about maternal behavior, mom taking care of her baby? However, think about that. Does every mom uh, do things the same way? No, not rigidly perform. Some bottle feed, some breastfeed, some use diapers, some cloth, some disposable, and so forth. It's quite variable, actually, in the type of behavior. And as well, maternal behavior in humans is not built in. Do moms automatically know what to do with their baby? No, they actually learn it from others for the most part. So even that we can't say really fits this description. Same thing on our other picture. What about building shelters like the bird building the nest? Again, humans very highly variable. Not every one of us builds shelters. That said, the shelters are so variable in their construction that we'll have to say doesn't quite fit that, although we might have the urge to have shelter at certain points. So instinct theory is really something that has now sort of, for humans, and looking at humans, been taken over more through evolutionary theories of behavior, and looking at maybe behavioral tendencies is what we end up with that we may have inherited from our ancestors. And for example, there are certain tendencies to prefer certain bodily characteristics in females that are prevalent in males. That seems to be kind of across the board. Certain characteristics are desirable. This seems to be something that males inherited from their ancestors, those things being indications of ready ability to reproduce. So, um, that said, it's more of a tendency than it is a uh, rigid behavior. Okay, so all right, our next theory, drive reduction theory, applies readily to animal behavior and human behavior as well. So, drive reduction theory. First of all, this involves drives, tension state that motivates behavior to satisfy a physiological need or to enable us to maintain homeostasis. So the idea is we have certain physical needs for survival. Now, food, water, oxygen, keeping our body temperature within a certain range, sleep, the need for sex in terms of perpetuating our species, and so forth. It's really a fairly limited list when you think about it. And I didn't mention a couple of them, but you get the idea. And so when these needs are satisfied, we're not influenced by this. But when there is something lacking, or when things are out of balance, then this produces a drive, this tension state that then gets us to do something to put things right in terms of that physiological need or homeostasis. So, for example, um, when we don't have enough energy in our bloodstream, then areas of our brain, in great part in the hypothalamus, will detect that. And this then leads to the production of a drive, a tension state that we call hunger. And hunger then leads us to do things that can replenish our energy, get our energy balance back into homeostasis. Now, in fact, what we do to reduce that drive can be quite variable. If we're hungry, well, we might, go to the refrigerator and look for something. We might go to the cafeteria. We might go to the grocery store. Maybe we're going to rob somebody of their food, or we're going to eat. Yeah, maybe we're going to kill something. But in fact, we'll want to do something to change that situation. So notice that the actual behavior here can be quite variable based on that person's learning history, the particular opportunities that are there in their environment, so on. Now, also, this need to reduce drives then can explain some behavior that otherwise doesn't make sense. And say, why would people be motivated to do things like, eat spoiled or unappetizing foods? Or why would a person on some occasions even drink their own urine? Well, in fact, these drives are very powerful motivators. So the person that is starving, yes, might actually, in a time of famine, eat rotting food or other unappetizing things. A person that's dying of thirst, yes, they might actually even, ingest their own urine in order to reduce that thirst drive. And so there you go. Okay, so that can explain a lot of behavior, from simply uh, food acquisition to wanting to adjust the temperature in the room or move to a room where the temperature is more suitable, you name it, a whole bunch of stuff. Okay, animals had humans. And that also brings up incentives. So, whereas these drives kind of have the sense of pushing us to do something to correct the situation, incentives are stimuli in our environment that pull us towards approaching certain stimuli to reduce drives. So they pull us rather than push. And here's an example, an incentive. The person who is food deprived, who is extremely hungry, smells bread baking. So that scent of baking bread becomes an incentive that pulls them towards wherever that smell is coming from to satisfy that hunger drive. The next theory we have is arousal theory. So, first of all, we have to deal with the question of, well, what do we mean by arousal? Now, a lot of people, when we talk about this, they think of sexual arousal, sexual desire, that sort of thing. And that could be here, or it could be a number of other types of arousal. Now, basically, we're going to look at states of arousal as being high, low, or moderate. So when we talk about arousal, what we're actually talking about is the level of physical and mental activation. So you might want to write that down. Level of physical and mental activation the individual is experiencing at any moment. So if we have a person that is in a high arousal state, what we're going to find is the body's going to be highly activated. Heart's going to be pumping hard, maybe breathing heavily and so forth, muscles tensing. And we're going to have mentally a very strong sort of feeling. Examples might be the person is in a what? Complete rage, high arousal, or terror, high arousal, or maybe they are in a sexually aroused state, highly aroused. Obviously, you can figure that one out. Okay. Now, we also have then lower levels of arousal. So moderate arousal is kind of what, you're going around your typical day-to-day activities. That's probably most of the time what you're experiencing, somewhere in between high and low. So where do we get into low levels of arousal? Well, maybe you're sitting in class or you're listening to this video and you're beginning to feel a little bit bored. That's a lower level of arousal. Maybe from bored you become sleepy. Oh, that's going down the chart even lower. Now it's a lower level of arousal. Now you're asleep. No, I didn't mean that as a hypnotic suggestion. You're not asleep, but you become, that's an example. So sleep even lower. Can you go lower than sleep and still be alive? Well, yeah, if you're in a coma. Okay, extremely low level of arousal, obviously. So you get the idea. All right, so the theory goes then that we want to um, we want to seek optimal levels of arousal, the best level of arousal for a particular situation. So this then results in some cases in what they call stimulus motives. So we're in a situation where there is little stimulation in our environment and our level of arousal becomes uncomfortably low. And so we're going to seek out something stimulating. Okay. So this is the urge to explore the environment in the absence of a physiological drives. Okay, so yeah, we put some baby monkeys in a cage where there's absolutely nothing to do. And so they might actually, just out of sheer boredom, low arousal, begin to mess around with the locks there, fiddle around with that stuff, just to what, raise their level of arousal, something more comfortable. Or you put a bunch of kids in a classroom with educational materials and nothing else to do there. Well, they might actually pick up those educational materials and maybe accidentally learn something. So this is also very consistent with what you might experience. You go and say you're standing in line somewhere. So, do most people, when they're standing in line waiting for long periods of time, do they just stand there and just the whole time? No, they'll look for something to do. You know, they'll what? Talk to another person in line, maybe if they're kind of outgoing and extroverted, or maybe if they're less so, they might what pull out their phone and begin to look at things on their phone or call somebody up or maybe play a game on their phone. All of this is what stimulus motives. They're looking for something stimulating. It's kind of uncomfortable to be there in that low state of arousal. So we can then look at also individual differences in preferences for arousal. So some people prefer high levels of arousal, or at least higher than most people. And we'd say these people have a sensation seeking personality. They're going to seek out things that are stimulating. So these are the people that are going to be looking for activities that gets blood pumping, looking for things like skydiving and race car driving and all of the extreme sports to get a thrill, you might say. Yeah, sensation seeking. Now you have people on the opposite end of that spectrum, and they prefer a very low level of arousal. Well, in that case, they're going to avoid those sorts of things, but rather be attracted to things that sort of are what? Lower that level of arousal, things that are relaxing. So maybe what? Engaging in relaxation exercises and meditation, or in terms of activities, maybe they're going to want to do something like read a book, or maybe play chess rather than go and do martial arts sparring instead of that. Maybe they would prefer to do something alone rather than with other people. So we have variations. And of course, a lot of us are sort of in between those two extremes. So maybe one day we want to watch a quiet movie. The next day we want to go ride a roller coaster. A lot of us are somewhere in between, go back and forth. Now, optimal levels of arousal also vary by task. And this is consistent with the Yerkes-Dodson law that we'll pick up later on. We'll talk about that, but all right. So here's an example. So you're driving to San Antonio, and it's kind of a monotonous drive in a lot of ways. And so you find yourself becoming a little sleepy or a lot sleepy. So what are the kind of things that you'll do in order to raise your level of arousal? Well, you might do things like what? Maybe you'll turn the music up, play the music louder. You'll fiddle around with the knobs on the dashboard that you didn't know what they did. Maybe you'll roll the window down or roll it up. Maybe you'll put the air conditioning on full blast or the heat full blast. Maybe you'll look around and try to look for interesting things. Maybe you'll strike up a conversation with a passenger, or maybe even, kind of whack them a little bit here and get one of these kind of things going. Um, or maybe, hey, maybe you'll stop and get some coffee, a stimulant. All of these things, kind of the ideas, you're trying to raise your level of arousal. You're fidgeting around doing all this stuff. By the way, do you notice that the types of behaviors that we just named, these are also the same kind of things that kids that have ADHD will do in a classroom? Yeah, what are they doing? They're messing around with things. They're talking out when they're supposed to be quiet. They're bothering the other kids. They're doing the same kind of stuff that we just mentioned. So interestingly enough, when they take these kids and they put them on medication, what do they put them on? They put them on stimulants. Why that? Well, it appears that one of the things related to ADHD is simply a naturally lower level of arousal, chronically low arousal. The stimulant raises that level of arousal artificially. Now the kid may find they don't have to do all that stuff simply to stay awake and keep up with the class. And what also seems to support this is a lot of times kids that are like that with ADHD, if you put them somewhere where there's absolutely nothing they can do, uh, short period of time, they'll just lay down and fall asleep. So one of the things that I've noted seems to be very common in ADHD is just a chronically low level of arousal. By the way, there's only a few studies out on that, so if you do the research and you find it's something really striking, give me some credit for the idea. But there's a little bit of it out there. Okay, now we might look at the other side of that, which is in some cases, behaviors are also uh, designed to lower our level of arousal. And here's a case in point. So let's say you had a really rotten day. You got up way too late and you rushed off to class. You ended up getting there late and finding that the exam was being given that you forgot about. And you come in there late and try to get through it, and then your next class immediately afterward, there's that paper due to turn in, which you didn't get printed out. So you're rushing to print it out, get there late with the paper, and the instructor won't accept it because it's late now. They're very hard nosed. And by the way, that's not me. Well, I do go by deadlines, but and then never mind. Anyways, so things aren't so good. And then you're finally done with class for the day, and you say, "Whew, glad that's over with." And so now you get to go to work. And while you're at work, the boss has a big pile of work to be done, and there's not enough time to do it. And the boss is hovering over you, telling you you're not doing it right, and it's too slow. And finally, you get done at work. You think, "Thank God I get to go home." And then on the way home, oh, I'll give you a choice. How about this? You get a speeding ticket, or you can have your choice, flat tire. Okay. Either way, pick whichever you like. So, what is your emotional state, arousal state going to be when you get home after a day like that? Your arousal state is going to be uncomfortably high after all of that unpleasant stimulation. And so, what are you going to tell people when you walk in the house, get home after a day like that? You're going to say something like this: I had a horrific day, just leave me alone. And you're going to want to just relax and let your level of arousal come back down to something that is more mm, acceptable to you. And, if anybody does mess with you, you don't want any more stimulation. You're likely to what? Fly off the handle, get angry, snap back at them because you don't want any more stimulation. You see how that plays into our behavior. Okay, so that can explain a lot of stuff that otherwise might not make a whole lot of sense. Okay, so moving on, we also can look at hierarchy of motives. This is something that was identified by Abraham Maslow. He looked at how people went about satisfying certain types of needs and found certain needs took priority over others. On the most basic level, our physiological or physical needs were the ones that people would tend to satisfy before anything else. And then later on, psychological, social, spiritual needs. Okay, but physiological needs seem to trump everything. So I don't know if you can see this well or not. This is actually a pyramid here. Sometimes they'll call it the hierarchy of needs or pyramid of needs. At the base of this, things people do first, physiological, hunger, thirst. Uh, oh, hey, you know what? That's what? Related to the drives we talked about earlier. Yeah, so let's satisfy drives first. What he found is then if people were relatively satisfied physiologically, then they would turn to needs for safety. So feeling that the world is organized, predictable, you feel safe, secure, you're in a stable situation. And if one felt relatively satisfied at that level, then people began paying attention to relationships with others. love and belonging. So to be loved, to love, to be accepted, uh, to not be alone or feel as if you're isolated or alienated from others. He then found that if people felt pretty good about that area of their life, then they focused on needs for esteem. So to achieve things, to be competent and independent, be recognized for your accomplishments, to have others respect you, all part of that. Now, if people's needs for esteem then were satisfied, he found then they would go on to engage in self actualization. So you might say this is what? Trying to become the best you can at whatever you're best suited for, be the best you could be, to develop your full potential that you have as a unique person, self actualization. So the first question I have for you is, do people always do things this way? And I think probably if you think about it, you'll conclude, well, mostly people do seem to operate like this, although you do see the exceptions. For example, you might see what? The firefighter that rushes into a burning building to save someone and risks their own safety and their own physiological needs temporarily in order to serve some higher purpose. Or you might see the person who goes on a hunger strike in order to highlight some particular important issue. So there are exceptions to this. Oh, and by the way, sometimes when we see exceptions, we kind of has a feeling, well, that's kind of crazy, you know. If you have a person that is starving themselves, but is for no reason, if we can't find anything else on here that this seems to serve, then we're going to say, hey, that seems to be what sort of a malfunction rather than having some actual purpose to it. Now, this is also useful, this hierarchy needs, if we're looking at, well, here we have a person and they seem to be stuck at some point in life. They can't seem to move forward, progress from where they're at. So we might go to this and try to look at this to help us identify just what is keeping them stuck in that situation. And for example, maybe we have a woman whose husband is beating her. Okay, so domestic violence that she's a victim of, but yet, even though others tell her, you got to get out of there, you got to get away from this, she stays there with the guy anyway. And by the way, we know that those things tend to what? Don't tend to just go away by themselves. They don't tend to get better. They tend to get worse, if anything. So we can look at this and begin getting a sense maybe of what's going on. So, in fact, maybe she's staying there just simply for the fact that it satisfies basic physiological needs. She's got food there, a roof over her head, so forth. And so, just simply those physical needs. Or it could be at the level of safety. You say, "Well, what do you mean? That's not safe to stay with that person." Well, but it does make the world predictable. She can predict that, yeah, this guy's going to be like that. And you know what? There's that old saying that the devil you know is better than the devil that you don't know. She may think that if she gets out into the bigger world, that it's even more scary and dangerous, feels actually safer, more secure there. And you might say it has something to do with what you're used to. It could also be at the level of love and belonging. The fact that um, they're there, there's a relationship, although very distorted, but yet they may sense that this provides for needs to belong, to be loved. And in fact, I've actually heard people say that in therapy. They say, yeah, he beats me, but I know he loves me, literally. Okay. So, you know, it may be that. And we have to then help them understand that this is not how love expresses itself in beating other people. Yeah. Um, it may be at the level of esteem. So the fact that they have the status of being married, actually having a husband, might be what's keeping them there, that others maybe won't respect them if they leave, that sort of thing. Oh, hey, I forgot something on the level of safety I might want to mention while I'm at it. Maybe the sense of safety has to do with the perpetrator actually threatening to what? Maybe kill them if they leave or harm their children if they leave. So again, they feel safer staying there. Oh, there's another one. Okay. Um, this could even be what is perceived as self-actualization for that person. They might see that in their mind, it might be that their mission in life is to change that person. And so they see themselves as developing their full potential as they try to change that person. And unfortunately, the news is that person is unlikely to change no matter what they do. So just wanted to give that as an illustration of how this can be useful in identifying how people have gotten stuck at some point in life, not progressing. Okay. Um, Hurricane survivors, don't worry about that. Um, we will notice, for example, in a disaster like Hurricane Katrina, that often people do follow this sort of pattern. And when Katrina hit, yeah, first of all, people were just interested in where can I get some food, where can I get some water. Very hot and muggy in New Orleans there. Then after they were able to satisfy needs for food and water, then often it was, well, where can I go that I can be safe? I and my family can be safe because a lot of hoodlums running around, so forth. Once they found a place to stay that seemed safe to them, then often the next thing was searching for loved ones that they'd been separated from. So this level came into play, and they had huge bulletin boards indicating where various people had ended up so people could find their loved ones. And then after people located their loved ones, often then the next step for them was actually volunteering to try to help others, which maybe is satisfying needs for esteem or self-actualization. So yeah, we see this pretty commonly in people. Okay, so there you go with that one. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to throw in something I didn't talk about in that first segment, introductory ones. I was adding some things. And in terms of social hierarchy, we'll talk about some social motivation in the video after this one. But we did notice on that effective um, neural circuits that one of them had to do with dominance and submission. And we seem to have kind of like a little counter there somewhere at the deep in our brain that's kind of counting, well, where are we on the social ladder? You know, are we near the top of that social ladder, in the middle, or near the bottom? Which then prompts us to behave in a way where we exert more dominance over other people, or try to do so, or maybe more readily submit to others. So this whole ranking process, what's it based on? Well, a lot of times in animals, it's based on, well, who's biggest or who is maybe most aggressive, um, who has the most potential for reproduction, those sorts of things with animals, although not always. It's, for example, with deer, the most dominant bucks are not always the biggest ones. Sometimes they're simply more aggressive. But there's a lot of that just based on the physical. And so we have that somewhat with humans. But in humans, it may be based on other things, like what? Power to get you to do what I want you to do. Having what? More money or a legal advantage, like a good lawyer, things like that. What we find is social hierarchies that are based on power tend to be pretty unstable. Now you see that even with chimpanzees. And in chimpanzee troops, sometimes you'll get an alpha male, the most dominant male, that got there simply by being the most powerful, but they usually don't stay at the top long. Why not? Well, what happens? Usually, a few of the lower ranking male chimps will gang up on them and put them out of power. Yeah. Okay. So what we tend to see is in chimpanzee troops, the top male that lasts longer as the leader is one that tends to be more social, as well as maybe having some of those power characteristics. So the male chimp that treats the female chimp, the baby chimps, nicely, more popular with the female chimps, obviously. You see the male chimp that will allow more of the other chimps to share in whatever has been uncovered, tends to stay in power longer than one that simply got there through power. And it's quite likely same thing is true of humans. So those who are ruling just by brute force, their time may be limited. Those that are instead dominant through caring for others and doing things that benefit others, pro-social behavior, will tend to stay in power longer. It might be something you should remember. Now, also, we can look at competency as being another basis for social hierarchies. Now, with us humans, that's not always the case either, that this is going to be the determining factor. You know, who's the most popular at work? Is it the one who does their job best? Not always, right? That said, we maybe ought to give more attention to ranking people on the basis of competency rather than power or how attractive they are to others. So, especially where being competent matters. So, mm, choosing the best person to lead the Centers for Disease Control shouldn't be based on who has the most power in that organization, shouldn't be based on, you know, who is the most attractive or most popular with everyone else, but rather who's the most competent. So I'm going to say, yeah, mm, competency-based hierarchy also something that we probably need to pay more attention to. Okay, so had to throw in some of my thoughts in there at the end, hopefully helpful. All right, now we're going to stop the video here. You'll notice there is one additional video for our chapter, which takes on as a representative drive hunger. It gives you some information about eating disorders and psychosocial motivation. So make sure that you catch the rest of that. It says here on Blackboard, but we'll put it in, yeah, it'll be in that learning module on Blackboard, okay, as the third part of this series. So catch that and have a great day. Hope everything goes well for you.